Everybody, it's a really pleasure to be here, and I will sit here because I know there's a camera pointed at me. If I start to get up, I walk all over the place, and that would be lethal for the recording purposes. So, but again, I appreciate Jean-Marc extending an invitation for me to come, and to the department and the university for facilitating this visit. My French is almost non-existent, so I'm going to have to resort instead to the other Canadian language, English. And so I hope you will bear with me as I move through this talk. Apropos of nothing, I am a great fan of Canada. I believe if one really believed in having multiple lives, which I don't, but you know, if that were actually true, I think I was a Canadian in an earlier life, because it's just I love coming to Canada. It's one of the most spectacular countries on the globe, and you're also given American policies on a variety of issues. This is one of the more sane countries certainly on the continent, in the world, frankly. So we look to Canada with envy on a whole host of issues. So it's very nice to be here, however briefly. Indeed, as Colette mentioned, I've over a career have studied just about every facet of communicating science to the public that I could drum up. But I began my career, once I left science writing, began my career as a social scientist, studying scientists and journalists and the interactions of those groups. Partly because, having been a science journalist, that was of just great interest to me, to better understand the dynamics of those interactions. Once I got into the business of journalism in an academic way and began looking for money to do research, I was pulled into what we call in the United States effects research, which again, all the money in the US is literally available to study the impacts of messages on audiences. And there was a fair amount of money available for those kinds of things too, particularly in the world of communicating risk information to audiences. And so I veered off in that area and has spent a good bit of the last 20 years or so doing research on audiences rather than on the producers of information. But it's been a treat recently to come back into this production side, working most recently with somebody who some of you met earlier in this lecture series, Hans-Peter Peters, from Jülich in Germany, and he and I have collaborated on a variety of projects over the years and are working on a new one at this point, exploring the ways in which he may have even talked about this in his talk, the ways in which neuroscientists of all groups react to public visibility and react to media coverage of their work in ways that might even affect the way they do research. And we'll be looking at that, at those interactions, both in the United States and Germany over the next year. So it's a pleasure to be back into this world of how information is being produced, and being able to look once again at scientists and journalists. The talk I want to give you today is I'm not focusing on an original research project, but on the results of a program of research over the years, things that I've learned through individual projects. And what I like to do when I give talks is tell stories about research. And so you won't see data here, but underneath all of this, and I'll try to refer to occasional studies as I go, are a lot of data, both mine and the work of a lot of other people. I want to talk about this whole area of contested science. Again, the ways in which journalists deal with it, the things that influence the choices that they make as they try to publicize controversial material. They run into a lot of roadblocks and a lot of issues that they're not even aware of sometimes. And I think it's a really fascinating area for study. As you know, let's see if we can get this guy to move. If I hit the button, there, okay. Almost all science is contested in one way or another. You're hard-pressed to find an area of science about which scientists fail to disagree. There's a double negative. Is that hard to understand or what? So scientists disagree in almost all cases. There are a number of issues that are far more public than others. I don't know if you're wrestling with this in Canada, but a major, major controversy in the United States now is the argument among many interest groups in our country that vaccines are linked to autism diagnoses in children. And here's an ad that reflects that assumption. That's really extraordinarily controversial, and like so many controversies, it's having a material impact. The herd immunity in the United States for certain kinds of diseases is now declining, and we're getting, for example, whooping cough epidemics because sufficiently few children in some communities are now not vaccinated for these kinds of diseases. So there are real health repercussions from these kinds of controversies. In this case, and again, if you follow these sorts of things, the best evidence we have right now is that there is no link between autism and vaccines. But one of the truly difficult elements of these controversies is that there is now a subset of individuals, many much more powerful than others, who have extremely strong beliefs in this link. And when you get situations like that, your ability as a journalist to cover this material is really presents major challenges, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You all have your own controversies here in Quebec. One of them, which you can't see from this little one, it's a very dark picture. These are shale gas workmen. And again, I've been fascinated to read more about the development of shale gas in Quebec. You're not too far away from what appear to be major fields, if you want to think of them as fields of this stuff. And again, I don't know how strong these controversies have become at this point, but it is a world where, again, there will be ongoing debates about what to value most, the jobs that get produced from the development of these fields and the equipment that you have to develop in order to frack this stuff, and the environmental issues, as well as the human issues that sit on the other side of that continuum. I was just reading in one of my science magazines from a couple weeks ago about the situation in Germany, where the Germans have been pushing alternate energy forms for a long time. If you visit Germany, you're confronted with one wind generator after another. At the same time, Germany is parts of Germany are sitting on enormous amounts of the dirtiest coal in the world. It's called brown coal, and they're going after it. This is the world of controlling carbon dioxide increases globally is going to, I think, require us to figure out ways to use coal in a more responsible manner. Some people talk about divesting ourselves of coal entirely. I've yet to see some analyses that make that possible. It would be great. But Germany, in spite of all of their alternative energy strategies, is now mining brown coal and is engaged in displacing entire towns in order to get at this stuff. And so it's a very interesting saga that we don't hear much about, and I'm wondering about the shale gas situation in Canada and the accompanying social tensions there too. The granddaddy of all controversial science arenas these days is global warming. And again, this one gets a lot of attention, both by researchers and by journalists. And again, there are countless mini controversies as well. As I say, almost any arena of science you stare at will be contested in one way or another. What I want to do is talk about how these things get covered and what some of the strengths and weaknesses of that coverage might be. The general approach to controversy and to journalists covering controversy is to focus on that coverage as an inherently bad thing. Okay, I don't know again about Canada, but certainly in the United States, there's a generic assumption that journalistic coverage of controversy is something that policymakers worry about, something that we should all worry about. And the okay, let me pull up that little thingy. And there are a number of reasons why that's probably so. One is the argument that journalists manufacture controversy, that it's an attention getter, and so controversy can be created where it doesn't exist. Another argument is that when controversy exists, that journalists overplay it by this all too familiar term, by sensationalizing information. One thing that's really interesting to do, incidentally, as a scholar, is when we get a lot of this critique in the United States, a lot of scientists talking about writers and journalists sensationalizing the science. When somebody says that, ask them what they mean by the word sensationalizing. And you'll find if you ask across a variety of individuals, you don't get the same answer. Okay, nobody really knows what that word means. All we know is that it's a way of saying this is a bad idea. Okay, so that's another critique that you see. Another is that that controversy highlights elements of science that lead publics to be critical of science. And so to air controversy is consequently bad for science in general. What's missing from all of this, I would argue, are reasons why, in fact, controversy or journalistic coverage of controversy can be a good thing. Okay, and I'm oversimplifying this, but one is that for one thing, controversy is indeed a natural feature of science. So if you are trying as a communicator to convey a nuanced understanding of what scientific process is, of the uncertainties that get built into science, of the challenges of trying to determine what's true about anything, dealing with controversy is a way of conveying that. Another reason, I think, is what we have learned over time is that controversy is a major alerting mechanism for audiences. If you are writing a story and you can legitimately indicate in that story that people disagree, you have now, your audience is glued to that narrative. And what some scholars have learned, thinking of Phil Titchener and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota some years ago, is that stories about controversy actually enhance learning in audiences. In other words, we're paying a lot more attention to those stories than we are to other types of stories. So if there's an honest controversy, you can actually help people learn about science through that coverage. And finally, and this is very interesting to me, is that controversial science and presentation of controversy actually is important to the relationship between science and the rest of society. In controversial issues, that's me, and it just does that. I don't know why it just did that, so don't worry about it. Anyway, in controversial issues, in many occasions, scientists are just as reliant on the mass media to figure out what's going on as are the rest of society. And it's really quite remarkable to watch this. I've seen occasions where scientists in a controversial situation, scientists on one side of the controversy will say to journalists, you know, when you learn something more about what the other side is saying, share that with me because I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. And so what controversy does is again, I think, increases the extent to which science is actually interacting with the social structures around it. And so I think there are some really good aspects to controversy that are not acknowledged in the critique. So given that, why does journalistic coverage of controversy have such a bad name? And again, in the United States, the default is to assume that this kind of coverage is flawed coverage, fundamentally flawed, and to critique it heavily. Well, one reason is that it is often badly flawed and misleading. Okay, this is a silly postcard from a community called New Madrid, Missouri, right in the. We're almost, when you hit this part of Missouri, you're now entering the South in the United States. It's a nondescript little community, but it has one very singular characteristic, and that is that it sits on a major fault line. Running down through the center of the United States is a large fault line that I think most recently in 1811, did what fault lines do every so often and produced a 7+ magnitude earthquake with an epicenter in New Madrid, Missouri. So this is a part of the United States that's sitting on an active fault line. But in this particular case, the story I want to tell here occurred in 1990 when a self-characterized geologist by the name of Ibn Browning declared that there was a 50-50 chance of a major earthquake with an epicenter in New Madrid, Missouri by and he gave a specific date, let's say June 30, okay. I mean, literally comes out with this prediction. Ibn Browning claimed that he had been had successfully predicted a previous California earthquake, and so was a credible expert when it came to this particular prediction. Journalists did what journalists often do. In this case, they covered the Ibn Browning and his prediction seriously. Okay. A few of them contacted geologists with the U.S. Geological Survey and were told by those individuals that this is nutty, okay? That Ibn Browning is not a geologist. That there was no scientific evidence that a major earthquake was that likely to occur. All these geologists acknowledge the presence of the fault and the inevitability of a major earthquake at some point, but there was literally no diagnostic information that suggested that an earthquake would occur 50-50 chance by June 30. So stories, our U.S. stories got written in classic U.S. ways, okay? Some journalists just reported on what Ibn Browning said. Others created stories that here's Ibn Browning making his assertions, and here are the geologists saying, oh, balderdash, this is not going to happen. What did happen as a result of this is that thousands of people fled the area, okay? Again, you can sort of imagine think of what you might do in a situation like this. All you see is, a fairly high uncertainty situation where somebody seems pretty darn certain there's going to be an earthquake. The precautionary principle alone would drive you away from your home. So people emptied the stores, took off on impromptu vacations, literally fled southern Missouri. And guess what happened? Nothing, okay? There was no earthquake. Of course, Ibn Browning was wrong, just as the geologists had predicted. And yet, here were a whole spate of stories that treated this issue as a controversy and that appeared to have done a grave disservice to audiences, okay? And so when we think about the bad name that controversial coverage has, this is the genesis for that critique, okay? Because a lot of stories get written like this, maybe don't have such dramatic repercussions, but have bad repercussions nevertheless. So why is this, okay? Take this kind of an example. Why would journalists do this? Why would a journalist hear an assertion from someone they don't know and decide that the best course of action is to provide that information to the public, or at the most check it out, and then having learned that others feel that the assertion is bogus, write a story that essentially provides both those perspectives. And this was one or the other characterized the coverage of this issue. Okay. Well, I think the reason these things happen is something I call the validity problem in journalism. And again, I'll invite you to respond at the end. I don't know if you're seeing Canadian journalism in any of this or not. I can certainly talk about the American patterns, but in America, journalists in the United States have a very, very difficult time deciding what's true in a controversial situation, and an equally difficult time communicating what's true to audiences. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So let me articulate those. One is that, classic journalism problem. In any particular issue, the complexity of the issue literally precludes that writer from being able to do a thoughtful, deliberate analysis of the situation. Every once in a while, a journalist will have a PhD in that arena, that specific arena, and might feel more comfortable judging the truthfulness of the claims that are being made. But more often than not, a journalist encounters a controversial science arena and is not really able to burrow into the science at a level that would permit her to decide who's telling the truth, okay? So one big issue is the complexity of information. Another equally big issue in the United States is that we expect our journalists to be neutral information transmitters. So when a journalist attempts to make a truth assertion, attempts to say, well, you know, here's this so-called geologist and here are these real geologists. If I were you, reader, I would listen to the real geologists, you know, because that's what I'm doing as a journalist. If a journalist tries to do that in the United States, they actually get very negative reactions from the public who don't believe that it is their job to analyze those different perspectives, okay? And I'll talk about that a little later because I have a strategy that I try to convince journalists to employ, and even that strategy is a problem because it does call on journalists to attempt to share with readers or viewers that one particular perspective may be, in Colbert's sense, more truthier than another, okay? Anytime you try to do that as a journalist, you have a problem, okay? So journalists, let me put it very as simply as I can, journalists have a very difficult time sharing with audiences what's true. Even though what we're supposed to be doing as journalists is sharing information with audiences about what's true so they can figure out what to do next, all right? And yet we don't do that for some very interesting and important reasons, okay? So instead, what journalists in the United States have done is they've come up with some coping strategies. And these are strategies, I'm going to talk about two here, that journalists use. I would argue these are strategies that are essentially surrogates for this validity problem. One is objectivity, and the other is the concept of balance. And I want to talk about each of those briefly for a minute. You've heard these terms before, probably understand them in your own way. I want to reframe them a little bit for you within this validity issue, okay? All right. When it comes to objectivity, the issue is, say journalists, if I can't know what's true, if I can't really know what's true, then what I will do instead is make sure that I accurately capture what somebody says and pop that into a story, okay? Objectivity, in other words, means accurately reflecting the information that you have been given or that you have sought out, all right? Now, that's a good thing, but as I note here, it focuses on a very interesting goodness of fit problem. It's a judgment about the fit between what somebody says and what is in the story that you have just written, okay? And scientists call that accuracy, all right? When scientists are very critical of the accuracy of science stories, it's the primary criticism that they have about public communication of science. And there's a fairly large literature now that looks at what scientists mean when they talk about accuracy. And what they mean is goodness of fit. Okay, it means I said something, and now I'm going to look at the story that you've written and determine if you captured what I said. Okay, now this is not a meaningless problem. I think accuracy is a really important attribute of a narrative. It has to be, in part because you've got to maintain, as a writer, you have to maintain a relationship with that source. So it matters that you get that right. But I'm going to argue here that it has nothing to do with what's true. That whole validity problem, totally ignored by this issue. Okay? Although scientists believe that accuracy is all about validity. It isn't. It's about reliability. Okay? It's about the goodness of fit between what somebody says and what's in the story. What somebody said may have been entirely wrong, But if you get it right in the story, you've written an accurate story. Okay. So I would urge us to, this is a very different way of thinking about accuracy, but I would urge us to care about accuracy, but not to give it the value that scientists place on it, because I don't think it has anything to do with with writers asserting what's true in a story. And that can be a big problem. So objectivity is a way of making sure that a story is accurate, which is to say a reliable fit between assertion and story, but has very little to do with truth claims and validity. Okay. The other issue is balance. And that surrogate behavior says, if you don't know what's true, Ms. Journalist, then get a bunch of points of view in the story. Okay? So balance says, if you can't say to your reader what's true, then make sure you get a variety of perspectives in that story, so that what you're really saying as a journalist is, the truth is in here somewhere. Okay? I am including perspectives that give you a sense of the continuum along which truth lies. Okay? And what journalists will often do is, instead of providing a whole variety of points of view, go to the endpoints. So if you're writing about vaccines and autism, you find a source who is a proponent of that link, and then you go looking for a source who is quite certain that the link does not exist. Okay. Now, there's a certain logic in this, if you think about it, because what a journalist is not saying overtly, but I think implies by this, is that I'm trying to capture the spectrum of opinion here in order to share with you, reader, the argument that, again, the reality is somewhere between these 2 points. Okay. But unfortunately, that's not what audiences get from those stories. There has been a small set of research projects now that explore our reactions to stories that balance. And when I say balance, what usually happens is you give sort of equal dollops of space to the proponent of the vaccine autism link and to the scientist who believes there is no such link. Now again, remember what a journalist is saying is, I can't tell you, audience member, who's telling the truth. I think the truth is somewhere on this continuum. Okay. When you show stories like that to audiences, they have a very different reaction. What they say when they look at those stories is, nobody knows what's true. Very different. Think about it for a minute. We're saying the truth is in there. We just can't point at it. We can't find that point on the continuum and point at it for you. And what audiences are saying, well, this means nobody knows what's true. It's a toss-up. And either of these things could be true, equally likely to be true. And that's not what journalists intend to convey. The end result of all of this, this concept of he said, she said stories, we characterize it like that in the United States. Again, there's somebody on this side and somebody on this side. Focus on accuracy, not on whether what's in that story is close to being true or not. Confused audiences and frustrated scientists. And journalists, American journalists, do this knowing full well that this is not a good idea. Let me mention the results of a couple of studies. I didn't do these, but way back when cold fusion was announced. Again, this was a case where two chemists announced they were going to hold a press conference at the University of Utah in order to announce that they had figured out a way to create fusion processes with cheap equipment at room temperature. People called it sort of tabletop fusion. And I remember talking to some journalists who were going to the press conference and who said to me, "Oh, this is bogus. We've talked, our physicist sources say this is just not real. There is no way this could happen." And then I remember listening to them as they talked, and I said, "But you're going to the press conference." "Oh yeah, we have to cover it. It's news. We have to cover it. It's going to be big news. Everyone else is going to be there. I've got it." This was a science writer for the Los Angeles Times. We're going to write it. And let the marketplace of ideas sort it out. Okay. So here's a case where, again, very, very common, where the journalist knew this wasn't going to pan out. In other words, it had highly credible sources sharing information that this was just really not a story, and it became major news anyway. Okay. Or a second very interesting, and this colleagues at a couple of colleagues studied this particular set of stories. Or another very interesting study was done by a guy named Jim Deering, who looked at what he called scientific outliers. These are issues where balance doesn't seem to make any sense, where there is a maverick point of view and and aside from this guy over here, a consensus. Okay, so Peter Duesberg, his claims that the HIV vaccine does not cause AIDS is a good example. Ibn Browning and his earthquake prediction is an example. The cold fusion story is an example. And what Jim did is he analyzed media coverage of these kinds of controversies and found, just as you would expect, that stories covered a variety of perspectives and treated these perspectives with respect, thus giving credibility to these different positions. So Peter Duesberg gets as much space in stories as the scientists who believe that, who think although he's certainly was a respected scientist for many years, that he's just nuts on this particular controversy. And story after story was like this. I mean, the bulk of the stories that Jim analyzed did this balancing act, okay? And again, what Jim argues and the audience reports seem to indicate is that, audiences seem to feel they have no recourse but to treat both sides as credible and to thus say that nobody knows what's true in these instances. Jim then took a second step. He interviewed the journalists who wrote these stories. And they said, similar to the LA Times reporter who I talked to many years ago, they basically said, yeah, this Duesberg is wrong. Ibn Browning was wrong. The chemists were wrong. These were not going to be legitimate scientific claims. But we have to cover them because they are legitimate news stories. And our editors will query us if we declare that this is just bogus and we're not going to write about it. So in multiple cases, controversial narratives show up, even though the journalists know that these are not even Steven sides, that there is one side is far more likely to be right than the other side. It's a real conundrum in the business, and if you do studies that explore coverage of these controversial issues, you see these patterns time and time again. And I want to argue here that while I really understand why journalists do this, again, the validity problem is a serious problem. As a journalist, if you try to declare one group of scientists righter than another group, you run a real risk of your own credibility taking a hit. So I understand the validity problem. I understand that objectivity and balance are surrogate ways of coping with this. But one can, I think, reliably argue that the resulting products do a disservice to audiences. In the case of objectivity, audiences don't have a clue whether what's in that story is even close to being true or not. That's not a good thing. And in these balanced stories, audiences are actually encouraged to think that that no one knows what's true at that given point in time. So one suggestion I have in my own work with journalists and students is what I call a weight of evidence approach to reporting. Again, remember, journalists can't be responsible for sifting through all the science in order to determine themselves what's true and what isn't. But I would argue that they should be responsible for determining where the bulk of experts lie on this truth continuum, and then sharing that information with audiences. And that's what I call a weight of evidence approach. In other words, you can't, as a journalist, individually say, let me tell you what's true, but you can say the bulk of climate scientists in the world believe this. Although there are other scientists who don't, they are essentially outliers in a community where the bulk of the weight of evidence is pointing in this direction. Those stories do acknowledge that there are other viewpoints, and it's actually really critical in stories to do that. Audiences, if they are aware that an issue is controversial, expect to see different points of view in the story. If it's just you saying the bulk of scientists think humans are making a substantial contribution to warming, okay, gosh darn it, readers, even though you're right, readers will immediately argue that you are engaging in biased reporting, that you are making truth claims. So it's important in any controversial story that story indicate that there are different takes on reality. But what's different about a weight of evidence story is it doesn't balance those takes on reality. It's really clear with audiences where the weight of evidence lies. Okay. Now, this sounds like it ought to be a no-brainer. Okay. How controversial can that kind of a story be? But in fact, again, let's go back to our favorite cold fusion story. Again, journalists felt that they could not do this. Okay, if they felt that if they wrote stories that sort of said, a couple of chemists are over here making a claim, but we need to share with you that they are probably wrong, say 99.9% of the physics community that works with fusion, editors actually would reject that kind of an account as an account that somehow devalued the two chemists who were having the press conference in Utah, trivialized the claims that they were making. Okay, so journalists who went after that story felt like they couldn't do the kind of story that I'm suggesting. And we have some evidence that when journalists do attempt this kind of story, they get into trouble. So here's another, oh, too dark again. I wonder why these are so dark, these poor little sweeties. This is there's a hand right there holding a silicone breast implant. Okay. That's that gooey looking thing on the right. Okay. And this is an interesting issue because, again, in the United States, some years back, a tremendous controversy erupted when women a number of women felt that problems they were having with implants were spiraling into major health conditions, major illnesses. They began to talk to one another. There were cases where individuals, a few scientists also felt that these implants could cause major health problems. It's literally ballooned, bad verb there, sorry, but into a major issue. Women began having these implants removed, and again, with the attendant risks of surgery. The maker of breast implants, Dow Chemical, finally declared bankruptcy because they were being dragged into court by groups of women who were determined to be compensated for the injuries that they thought they were suffering. It was a very dramatic set of events. And the problem was there was no good evidence about the link between these implants and health problems. However, out in the rest of the world, there were some big epidemiological studies underway, mostly in Europe. And the studies included, among the things they asked about in these epi-studies were, they actually had data. They recorded whether individuals in the study had any kind of, had things like breast implants. And so they were able to follow these women over time to see if individuals with breast implants were more likely to have health problems than those who were not. So there was an epi-study. It was not cross-sectional in a sense, it was over time, so you actually could get at the notion of causality as a result. And when those data came in, as is the case, I think, in a lot of these controversies, the answer was there was no link between implants and the type of health problems that women were reporting, okay? Connective tissue problems and immune response problems and things. No evidence whatsoever that implants were linked to those problems. New York Times reporter Gina Collada is a weight of evidence reporter, and she covered this issue. There was a front page story in the New York Times where she literally wrote a weight of evidence story where she said, again, for years, controversy has bubbled over breast implants. There are communities of individuals, she says in her story, who feel very strongly that these implants cause health repercussions. But then she said, major epidemiological studies whose results have just been reported indicate that there is no link. And made it clear that these, and this is what a weight of evidence story does, these are the best scientific data we have to date, and they do not support that link. It was fascinating to watch what happened after that story came out. Gina was excoriated by the women who were just outraged that the linkage that they to this day firmly believe exists wasn't proved, by journalists who were unnerved by the fact that a reporter might make that kind of weight of evidence assertion. I remember one article in an American magazine that accused Gina of being in the pocket of Dow Chemical. In other words, biased reporting, right? Saying things that would be that would fit the belief system and the pocketbook of the industry itself. It was a fascinating scenario to watch, and I think it illustrated the challenge of doing something even as simple as sharing with readers or viewers where the weight of evidence lies. Those challenges continue. Here is again the latest saga of the autism and vaccine story. A guy by the name of Wakefield, the scientist on the left, he was a UK scientist. He had come out with an early article that suggested there was a link between vaccine and autism. He now has been thoroughly debunked. The latest information, this was about a year ago, the UK revoked his license as a doctor. He's literally been set aside. I think his career has been ruined by this. What you see on the other article here, the other one is the cover of a book, again by a physician, American physician, who is written about the battle that has gone on regarding this link. And what's interesting about this is that neither of these events, if you will, has changed the landscape in any material way. Offit reports that he gets punishing mail and email from people who are just outraged at his position on autism and vaccines. And Wakefield will continue to be a hero among the communities who still believe in that link. How do you, I mean, it's a very interesting, how do you construct a weight of evidence story in this kind of fraught landscape? It is almost impossible to do without taking yourself, as a writer, an enormous amount of heat. So, how do you construct a weight of evidence story? Okay, again, you do your homework. Where do the experts land on the issue? And this is not easy to do for beginning writers. It's extremely difficult to get a sense of where the credible individuals are on an issue. And sometimes even they don't know enough about where the weight of evidence lies. They're so invested in their own points of view. So it can take time to unpack these landscapes. You have to also in these stories be respectful of the different beliefs that people have. One way to try to diffuse the volatile nature of controversy is to be respectful in a story of the fact that there are points of view, that there are people genuinely believe, for example, that vaccines are linked to autism. And that there are, and you even saying in stories, there are reasons why these people believe this. I mean, again, it's such an interesting issue. It turns out, of course, that children get vaccinated, and this is the killer for this, at about the same time that the typical autism diagnosis gets made. And so what happens is the proximity of those two events sometimes gets recalled, particularly in an environment where there are interest groups who are communicating with the public that this link is real. So kid gets a vaccine, a year later is diagnosed with autism, and guess what the parents do? They're frantic, trying to figure out, I mean, autism is one of those horrible, horrible situations where we don't know what's going on. We're trying, researchers are trying desperately to figure out what's happening. If you're a parent, I mean, this is just an utter tragedy is the wrong word here, but it is a life-shattering moment to have to deal with this kind of what will be a lifelong condition for a child. So you go looking for reasons, right? So again, I think it's really important in stories to take those different beliefs with respect, and to try to indicate in a story that you're not trying to trash what other people think. You're trying to figure out what's true. And then to be clear about where the experts are on the issue. Sometimes, again, there is not a consensus. So the weight of evidence may lead the community in a certain direction, but there's still a fair amount of disagreement. You have to be able to share that in a story, in a weight of evidence story. You can't oversimplify the landscape and create that kind of attackable narrative. And you need to provide some evidence to back up those claims. You need to be able to include in stories information that makes it clear to the reader or the viewer that the weight of evidence is in fact in a particular location. There's no reason, again, remember that neutral transmitter role that journalists play, there's no reason for anybody to believe your efforts. You have to, what's that old cliche in journalism? Show me, don't tell me. You have to show readers where the weight of evidence lies. Now, this is a very complicated story. And I think part of the reason we don't see stories like this is that they're tough to do. They take time. They take space. Editors are not particularly cued in to these issues. They're still living in a world where objectivity and balance work perfectly fine. Thank you very much. So again, this is also a type of story that can cause the media organization you work for some trouble if, in fact, the groups that feel that you have done a disservice to the truth by trying to share weight of evidence make themselves heard in the newsroom. So it's really not easy. But I think this, to me, is the gold standard for reporting controversy. I think I haven't seen much of this kind of reporting. Again, I think there's some real interesting research possibilities here to be able to go in and see if journalists are, in fact, sharing these kinds of variables with audiences. I haven't done this kind of work yet, and I think that'd be, again, I don't know how likely one will be to find it, but to be able to go in and try to characterize some of this coverage of controversy in a way that allows us to look for this type of reporting, I think would be interesting to do. So I'm going to stop now, just in case I'm about to put you to sleep.